Before we get started with this episode, let me point out the obvious. It's the gift-giving season. But what isn't so obvious is that you can get your gifts and help out the podcast by going to comicsalternative.com/Amazon. Click through on our Amazon banner, and whatever you get during that visit, the Comics Alternative will get a few cents kickback. So get your Hanukkah, Christmas, Kwanzaa, and Festivus gifts through our Amazon associate links. It's a smart way to shop, and you'll be helping out the show. So let's get started with this thing.
Here comes Santa Claus, right down Santa Claus Way.
This is the Comics Alternative Interviews, back yet again with Bill Kartalopoulos. Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Comics Alternative Interviews. I'm Derek.
And I'm Sterg, and we're two guys with PhDs talking about comics.
And on this episode, we're glad to be talking with Bill Kartalopoulos. He is the series editor of Houghton Mifflin Harcourt's Best American Comics series. But before we get to that conversation, we want to let all of you know that this episode of the Comics Alternative Interviews is brought to you by the great folks at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to their website, dcbservice.com, for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. There, you're going to find all DC, Marvel, Image, and Dark Horse titles at 40% off of the cover price if you pre-order. For all of the other publishers, you'll find that those discounts can be anywhere from 20 to 35% off of the cover price. And every single month, you're going to find some mind-blowing specials. Sometimes those specials could be as much as 45% off the cover price. Sometimes 50% off cover, but every now and again you can find discounts that are even more impressive than that.
That's right, Derek. And at 50% off, which is a huge discount, you can look at the bundles, and there are bundles available right now for Jinx World, Valiant, and Vertigo, in alphabetical order even.
Yeah. You know, you really can't beat the great prices at Discount Comic Book Service. If for no other reason, discount is in their name. That's dcbservice.com. You gotta go there. You got to. It's imperative. Because they'll take care of all of your comics pre-ordering needs. And after you do get your comics there, please be sure to send them an email and tell them that Sterg and Derek, the two guys with PhDs talking about comics, sent you.
That's right. And then we'll get a nickel.
Yeah. Or a pat on the head.
Pat on the head.
Yeah.
I like that.
Now, the DCB service guys are really nice to us. They've been our sponsors for about 5 years, and we love having them as supporters of the Comics Alternative.
Mm-hmm. I use them. They're good. I forget sometimes. It's just a book shows up, and I'm like, oh my God, I totally forgot I was going to buy this, and now it's here.
You know, one of the things we do, or we try to do every year for the past several years, is to have Bill Kartalopoulos on toward the end of the year, which is around the time that we discuss the current year's Best American Comics volume. And I think there was one year that we weren't able to arrange a time to have Bill on the show. But I know this is the first time that we're doing this with you, and but I wanted to have Bill back on, if for no other reason, to get the two of you to talking and to use Greek greetings. But also, it's always fun to have Bill on the show to talk about the current year's Best American Comics volume and his experiences with it and the year's guest editor. We don't so much talk about the contents because, you know, you and I will do that in this Wednesday's episode, right? Our penultimate show of the year.
That's right. Tune in.
That's right. Tune in. But we also talk to Bill, or specifically talk to him about the process of editing, of getting submissions, of being the series editor, finding a guest editor every year, all of that.
Oh, yeah. And I appreciated learning a lot about it. I mean, this is a huge undertaking, making this book. So I was glad to get a lot of detail.
Yeah, it is. And I think it's useful to talk with the series editor about this because, you know, there are some people who may not know about the series who may pick this up and go, oh, it says on the cover, the Best American Comics. 2018. And so I think automatically there may be some misconceptions, right? Someone who is maybe unaware of what goes on in the making of the volumes within the series may think, well, why aren't there any comics from 2018 in there, right? Or they could say, these are the best American comics. I don't see any superheroes. Well, I mean, there's a reason for that. I mean, there's several reasons for that. And we could talk about that in the review show. But I think it is really useful to have Bill on every year to, let's say, remind our listeners what all goes into the best American comics volumes, but also to let us know some of the could be unique issues that come up every year.
Yeah. And I appreciated hearing that. I mean, it's a contemporary book with a lot of moving parts and a lot of things to consider for selecting and for, I don't know, just getting things in there for us to read. I really appreciate it. Bill's a very thoughtful editor from what I've gathered.
Well, let's go ahead and listen to Bill talking about those many moving parts.
That sounds good to me.
We are really excited to have back on the Comics Alternative Bill Kartalopoulos. He's the series editor of Houghton Mifflin Harcourt's The Best American Comics. And as we have for the most part over the past several years, we like to have Bill on right around the time that we discuss the current year's Best American Comics volume and get his take as series editor on the current year's volume. So, Bill, welcome back on the show.
Thanks for having me back.
Yeah, I'm excited to talk to you, Bill.
Yeah.
Nice to talk to you for the first time, Sterg.
And before we get started, I would say that since all three of us are big-time comics fans, that we would be geeking out in discussing this. But since both Sturge and you, Bill, are of a particular origin, I'd say that we're about to Greek out.
Okay.
I was bragging to Derek that I can Google you without reference. I was like, "Hey, Kartalopoulos." It's just, I just write it.
It's always a pleasure when someone can spell my name.
Yeah, that's my thing is like when you're Greek, you spell your name forever to everyone.
Yeah. Yeah. I definitely don't take it personally when my name is misspelled. It happens more often than not.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Bill, if you remember, for last year's volume, I had a really good time talking with not only you, but the 2017 volume editor, Ben Catcher, which was really an interesting conversation. I think it was the first and only time so far that we've done these interviews where both the series and a particular year's editor is in on the conversation. And I know one of the things that we've discussed on both that show and in the past is how different of an experience it may be for you to work with different editors. And so this year, the series editor is Phoebe Glockner. She couldn't join us for this conversation, but I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about the process of working with Phoebe.
I mean, I don't know if it's that markedly different. The thing I would say that characterized the couple of volumes before that is that both Ben Catcher and Roz Chast, who I worked the year before, were local. Ben lives in New York. Roz Chast lives in Connecticut, but she's in New York quite a bit. She's not that far away. It's just a real short commuter train ride away. So I was able to do a lot more in-person work with both of them, whereas Phoebe Gloeckner lives in Ann Arbor, Michigan, where she's a professor at the University of Michigan. So that was kind of a return to my previous experiences working with Scott McCloud and Jonathan Lethem, who were both living on the West Coast, where the majority of the work was just conducted via email and telephone and sending boxes in the mail and things like that. So, I mean, that's just a real basic practical difference. And beyond that, every guest editor brings, I think a very different point of view to the work that's most evident in the selections that they choose for a particular volume.
Yeah. And Bill, I was wondering if you could just speak a little bit about, I know you've been interviewed on this show a few times at this point, but just about the role of a series editor versus, I mean, does that mean you have final say? Does that mean you introduce the the comic to the other editor? How does that work?
The Best American Comics is pretty much structured in the same way as all of the other, or most of the other, Best American titles that Houghton Mifflin Harcourt publishes. This annual series is part of a larger group of annual titles that all have Best American in the title. Mm-hmm. And that sort of dates back to 1915, the original title that became the root of the series or group of series is Best American Short Stories, which started in 1915 and has continued in some form or another since then. And gradually over time, that kind of gave rise to other similar annual Best American titles, with Best American Comics starting in 2006. So almost all of these titles are structured in the same way, in that there is a series editor who works on the book for multiple volumes, and the series editor has a certain range of responsibilities. Among them, the series editor receives everything that comes to that comes in as part of the open submission process for the book. So all of these books have an open submission process. Literally anyone can send their work in, and we consider it all with equal attention, whether it's a well-regarded graphic novel from a large publisher or a handmade zine or something that was posted online or whatever. So certainly the series editor receives a huge volume of submissions. On top of that, it's generally the series editor's job to just kind of be aware of the field, to be making sure as much as possible that we're getting the things that the series editor thinks that we should be looking at, which includes reaching out to publishers and self-publishing artists and asking them to submit their work. It includes just kind of generally being aware, keeping an eye on press and social media to see what's out there. I go to comic book stores and see what's coming out. I go to a couple or more comics festivals every year, which is also a good way to see a lot of small press and self-published work that one might not have seen otherwise. So in the course of all of this, I amass a very large pool of material to consider. The next step is that I read and look at everything, and each year I select about 120, or usually a bit more, a few more pieces to send to each year's guest editor. The guest editor then has final say on what actually goes into the book, based on their evaluation of the material that I send, but they also have the flexibility to bring in work that they may have discovered on their own as well. So after that, once the guest editors made their final selections, then the series editor has a whole range of other responsibilities that have to do with the logistics of pulling together this volume once every 12 months. That includes reaching out to artists, getting permission to run the work, getting their files, gathering some information from them, working with the in-house design and production people at Houghton Mifflin Harcourt, and so on and so forth, as well as writing the foreword, and the guest editor contributes an introduction. So that's basically the outline of how those two roles interact, I think. But if there's any part of that that's still unclear that I missed, please feel free to ask a more specific question.
Yeah. Well, and we should maybe remind listeners, or just tell them if they're not aware, that every volume of Best American Comics basically includes material from September of, let's say, the 2 years before to the very end of August that previous year. So, for instance, this year's 2018 volume, you're including material that was released between September 1st of 2016 and August 31st of 2017.
Yeah, that's right. Because, and again, this is consistent with the other Best American titles. Just the lag time exists just because of the amount of time it takes to read and select work, and then to do all those other less glamorous things that I was talking about, like get permission and take a list of comics and turn it into a 400-page full color hardcover anthology that comes out like clockwork every fall. So basically, a good way to think about it is that the selection parameter for each book, chronologically anyway, is that it goes from autumn to autumn, and then the book comes out the following autumn, because it takes about a year to put the thing together.
Mm-hmm. And one of the things, I was curious about, you were talking a moment ago about the process of accumulating or becoming aware of comics that could be considered for each year's volume. And you even write about this a little bit in this year's foreword. I was wondering, now, this is like how many years now since you've been series editor?
Well, the first one that I worked on was the 2014 volume. Mm-hmm. Technically, the one that just came out, the 2018 volume, is the fifth one that I've worked on. It's been 4 years since the first one that I worked on came out. Mm-hmm. But, relative to what we were saying before, because that 2014 book covered work from late 2012 to late 2013. If I recall correctly, I was hired in, I think, late summer of 2012. So technically, I've been working on the series for 6 years, but something like that. 5 volumes have come out over a period of 4+ years at this point.
Well, the reason I'm asking is because I'd be curious to know what your experience has been over these past several years in terms of the amount and even the kind of submissions that you've been getting. I'm not necessarily referring to the things that maybe you find on your own, but because that's going to happen regardless. But in terms of just getting material submitted to you blindly, right? Something you may not even know. Have you noticed an increase, a leveling off, or a change in, the type of submission that you've been getting over the past 5-6 years?
It's hard to say. We get so much stuff, and we always have. I think is specifically talking about the blind submission part. I can't really compare my experience to the other series editors, but I think over the years that I've been working on it, because we have run consistently a fair bit of work that's self-published, often, from very small editions, like zines, essentially. Mm-hmm. I think over time, enough people have noticed that work really does stand a chance of getting into Best American Comics. And as a result, I'm probably maybe getting more zines and self-published things now than I was even at the very beginning of the process, for me, based on the years that I've been working on it. Which is not to say that we weren't already getting work like that. But I do think that probably I've been getting more zines and small handmade self-published things even than when I started.
Okay. And do you think that that's due to the growing popularity of this series? And the reason I'm asking is because one of the things I've noticed over the past few years that I hadn't either noticed or paid attention to earlier is that a lot of books, this is a major publisher, Houghton Mifflin Harcourt, and I've noticed that a lot of bookstores like Barnes & Nobles will prominently display the year's volume in the fall when it comes out. And so I would guess that the awareness factor over the past few years may have increased a bit.
I really can't say. I really can't say if that's the case. I think it has more to do regarding what I was talking about specifically. I just think it has more to do with perhaps to a certain extent informal peer networks. You know, so that if someone sees that an artist who they like or know or follow, who they might not have expected to see in the book, is actually there, that encourages people to make submissions, or you know, it's difficult for me to speculate about motivations like that, and certainly it's very hard for me to know how people are seeing the book in the world, and if more people are noticing it or fewer or whatever. But I think that's principally just a response, as I said, one way or the other, to the fact that we just have been publishing a fair amount of self-published work in every volume.
Yeah, and that's one of the things I appreciated in reading through the volume too. Is, you know, there were some things that I clearly thought were okay. This is a zine somewhere, or you just describe it because there's descriptions. And, you know, I appreciate that kind of thing because they tend to be limited print runs, and they're things that are hard to get your hands on. I mean, usually when they sell out, they're gone and you don't have a chance to get them. But I'm also wondering, do you get a lot of like digital or online kind of comics? Do you get a fair amount of those in submissions, or do you get many at all? I'm just wondering.
I do get a fair number of those in submissions in a variety of forms. I get quite a few emails from people sending me either PDF versions of comics that ran online or links to sites where I can see comics that ran online. Even occasionally some people print out comics that ran online and send them to me in envelopes. So I do see a fair bit of that material through submissions, but it's still, I'm aware, just one potential arbitrary core sample of the vast universe of things that are being posted online. So, I mean, I pay some attention to sites that aggregate material online, or simply things that I see being shared a lot on social media.
Mm-hmm. And I have another question. Just, this is related to the job, and this is one of those things that, you know, I'm in education, literacy education to be exact, and a lot of people that they look at me and they're like, "Oh, you get to read comics and do work with comics and get paid for it," and they're all like, "Ooh, dream job." And then I listen to you. I know, fortune and glory, you know. Well, I get to read comics, but I listen to you and you're like, well, for what you're describing sounds like you read a lot of comics, like a ton of comics. And to a certain, you know, there's a part of me that's like, sounds awesome. Like I just come in 9 to 5, read some comics. And then, you know, it's probably not like that, I'm imagining.
No, not at all. I mean, certainly it's not a 9 to 5 job. I mean, none of these series editor positions are full-time positions. You know, it's not as if I think maybe if you're imagining it which is a dream job, it's the imaginary fantasy of someone setting you up in an office with a working coffee pot and a big pile of comics to read every day. But I mean, the truth is, I mean, this is part of what I do. I also teach, and I'm working on a book for Princeton University Press. I'm doing other work. But anyway, which is not to say this is not an intensely pleasurable thing. That's why I've been doing it for 6 years now. But no, it is great. There are a number of things that are wonderful about it. But it is also a high volume of material to read, and a certain amount of I would just say kind of a sort of feeling of responsibility, and that's balanced against a kind of feeling that there's so much stuff out there that, you know, unfortunately you're probably going to miss something every year, you know. Sure. So there's that part of it too. And, you know, and there are deadlines. So there are times where I just have to hole up for a weekend and get through as many piles of comics as I can in order to be able to get material to the guest editor in a timely manner. Having said all that, it's fantastic because I do get to see a ton of material, certainly eligible material anyway, new North American comics published each year. It's definitely a privilege just on a very basic level. For example, to hear about some new book that's coming out from, publisher X that seems interesting to me, and to know that, oh yeah, I'll read that. Like, I don't even have to, go to the store and buy the book and make time for it. I just know that eventually I will be reading all of that through my process. And it gives me a very interesting window into the new releases that are coming out on a year-by-year basis, as I said, ranging from work by larger publishers all the way down to self-published zines that maybe I wouldn't have seen otherwise. I think one of the other real privileges of it is that it's a job that really requires, I think, the series editor to be looking at a very wide range of work in an open-minded way. While, I think anyone would come into this job with certain priorities and preferences, I do feel that it's essentially my professional responsibility to treat every submission seriously. And I think having to do that and having to engage a wide range of work that I wouldn't necessarily always have sought out myself as a reader is extremely beneficial. And beyond that, one of the other great pleasures of the job is collaborating with the guest editors every year and having a chance to really engage their point of view. So all those things are definitely great. So I didn't mean to undersell the job, but I think anyone who's in a position that someone would call a dream job would be quick to point out all the ways in which, the fantasy is just a fantasy.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. You said something just now, Bill, that brought to mind an experience I had in reading your foreword for this year's volume. And I always look forward to not only that year's editor's introduction, but also to your foreword, because I think that what you say in every year's volume, in your foreword as the series editor, it highlights a particular and I think a great conversation-worthy topic dealing with the selection or comics in general. And I remember last year talking with you and Ben about your foreword, where you made a very persuasive case of experimentation, comics on the edge, doing different things, and how that's beneficial to the medium as a whole, not only to critics, but also to creators themselves. And not only for the more, let's say, indie experimental stuff, but also for the mainstream. And I really enjoyed that. One of the things that stood out about your forward for this year is what you mentioned just a second ago, and that is the necessity of being open-minded and a critic's role and responsibility in a task such as this. And I got the feeling that you were making this statement as a way of not only explaining why some of the selections in this were made, while at the same time admitting, as you rightly do, and Phoebe does as well, that, personal taste, there's no way to completely eliminate that, right? I mean, you can't be any kind of critic or editor cannot be 100% objective in the truest sense of the word. But I also wondered if maybe what you wrote in your foreword in this year's volume may have had something to do with any kind of reaction that you anticipated from certain readers. Let's say, hey, this is not a comic that I recognize as a comic because I grew up reading, titles X. But this is very different. But you seem to be, I don't want to put it this way in a negative way, but almost like a preemptive strike of addressing readers' potential, maybe questioning of why is this in here? This is not a comic, at least as the way I understand comics.
Well, I wouldn't say that I was necessarily anticipating any kind of reader response to any particular pieces that were in this volume. But I would say that in part, I think I was trying to offer maybe a counter to what is the perfectly understandable and quite reasonable way that perhaps some or many readers react to any anthology, an anthology like this one, or maybe even any anthology, which is essentially to just viscerally say, oh, I like this, I hate that, I like this, I hate that, and the anthology is more or less successful based on how that balance sheet works out in the end. To me, I think probably the most interesting thing about Best American Comics, and probably the rest of the Best American titles, is the subjectivity of the guest editor. As you were saying, of course, any critical project incorporates subjectivity. And in some ways, I try to be very open in my role as guest editor. As my role as series editor. I know the guest editors also think very deeply about the work that goes into the book. But in some ways, I think maybe they're a little more free to just be subjective, because at the end of the day, they either really care about a piece or don't. They really feel strongly about putting something in the book, or they don't. And, and maybe in some ways too, they have that license because most of them are artists or authors or creative people. And I kind of look at the guest editor role almost as a kind of, indirect creative expression using other people's work, kind of like making a collage. And I think it's maybe less interesting as a response for someone to just consider whether or not the work lines up with their own preferences, and more to think about why the guest editor saw value in each individual piece. So in some ways, that's where this year's forward was coming from.
Hey, Bill, I was wondering you were talking about responses to the book, and what do you hear? I mean, who do you hear from when you put a book like this out? Because, I mean, I've published books, and, you kind of haunt Amazon and hope that somebody reviews it or hope somebody picks it up. But, I mean, how do you get feedback from this book, number one, and who gives it to you? Like, who provides the feedback? Like the public, the readership?
It's, to be honest, I mean, I would say it's pretty anecdotal. Mm-hmm. I mean, of course, there are people who post reviews on websites. They're ranging from media all the way down to commenters on Amazon or other sites like you mentioned. Mm-hmm. And that's something. It's a way to get, and of course, and podcasts. And that's something. It's a way to get some feedback. Relative to the larger reading public, it's always, though, just a very tiny sample set. I certainly hear feedback from other artists, which can be meaningful to me. If particularly if it's someone who maybe I have some contact with, but who isn't a very close friend necessarily. But if someone reaches out and says, "Oh, hey, the new volume of Best American Comics is really good," again, that may not be representative of the broader reading public. But it's meaningful to me anyway, if it comes from a colleague or someone whose work I respect or something like that. So it's pretty anecdotal. It's hard, I think, as you say, it's hard to get a broader temperature reading beyond that. And I do, on the one hand, I do pay attention to any feedback that I hear. And when I hear feedback that I think I need to take seriously in one way or another, I think about it. On the other hand, I'm not sure that there's any good way to really know exactly how people are, as a large body of diverse readers encountering the book with different backgrounds and in different contexts and in different situations. I don't know how one would really get a good overall picture of that. But I mean, I'm working right now on the Best American Comics 2019. I can't say one word about the contents of that right now, but I was speaking with one of the artists whose work is going to be in the book, and she was very happy to be in the book, and she said that it was very meaningful to her because she had been reading Best American Comics from the time she was in college. And because the book's been coming out since 2006 at this point. Right. So I think all of these books have a lot of quiet influence because they exist out in the greater world. Like you were saying, they do have some privileged placement at Barnes and Noble type bookstores and things like that, and they exist in the broader world as hopefully accessible entry points into the bigger field of comics. They exist in a lot of libraries, and for someone who's exploring comics, it's one of several good starting points to get a sense of what the range of contemporary comics is, get a sense of who the authors are out there, who they might want to follow up on. So I think the book actually has a lot of quiet influence. It has probably a lot of responses that we'll never know. So I definitely don't want to take, a handful of commenters on Amazon or whatever too seriously in that regard necessarily, because that's a small self-selected sample set. That doesn't mean that there aren't things worth attending to from every quarter.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Now, one of the things that I would guess is that every year's volume and the submissions that you get has its own, I guess, unique challenges, and whether that be with the submissions themselves or the process of communicating with that year's editor, as you had mentioned earlier, right? Distance can be a practical issue in some ways. I'm wondering how you think that in terms of the 2018 volume, what was one of the biggest challenges that you and Phoebe may have faced in pulling everything together?
I'll be honest with you, just off the top of my head, I'm not thinking of anything that stands out as a particular challenge of this volume, relative to other volumes. I think we actually, in some ways, got a little lucky in the sense that compared to some other volumes that I've worked on, for example, we didn't really have a lot by way of format issues, which is something that comes up working on this series sometimes, by which I mean to say, one of the things we're doing with this anthology is we're taking a wide range of previously published work and essentially recontextualizing it within this, hardcover book that has a fairly standard format, 7 inches by 9 inches. And one of the things about the world of comics is that these books are published in a wide variety of formats, ranging from online work to oversized work to risograph printed zines and all this stuff. And sometimes that creates a lot of issues in terms of just figuring out how best to present the work within this more standard format. And occasionally it leads a guest editor to think that, maybe a work is just so far off in format from what we're working in that maybe our volume just isn't capable of representing that work well, and maybe that might be a reason to include something else instead. Whereas I think everything actually went relatively smoothly with this volume. We didn't have a lot of issues in that regard. I think everything accommodated itself pretty well to our format. There were a few little things that we did here and there in terms of reformatting, but I think everything worked out well, and the artists were all amenable to the kind of minor interventions that we had to make occasionally to present their work within the format of this volume.
Okay.
When you get to the end point, Bill, do you guys agonize over like what's the last story going in here, or what's the last comic, or are there like does that happen?
You mean in terms of
like what you
finalizing the table of contents, essentially?
Right, and what you can actually include as the comics themselves.
Yeah, the guest editor usually gets to a point where they have a just about final list of material that they want to include. But then what we need to consider is the basic issue of page count, because we have X number of pages in the book. And so that involves a bit of unglamorous spreadsheet making and math. And I mean, sometimes, usually it has been the case that we get to a point where the guest editor has a pretty close to final list. But then once we sort of hash out, how many, if it's an excerpt, how many pages do you want to excerpt, and how many pages are all these pieces, and how is this all working out, and are we leaving enough room for the front matter and the back matter and all of the other things that take up some page count in the book. It does often get to a point where a guest editor might have to make a tough choice or two. We might be just a little over, and there's really, despite all the trimming and adjusting and so on, that sometimes it has gotten to the point where there's nothing left to do but to really make a decision about how do we get this down to our page count. And that may mean taking out one of the pieces in the book. But I don't make the decision about how to deal with that, but I just present the guest editor with the information about where we are in terms of page count and where we need to get to. And that has occasionally necessitated some tough choices at the end.
Gotcha.
And I would guess that, given what you said and what you've told us in the past about the year's guest editor having the final say of what goes in, that the organization of a particular year's volume is also up to the guest editor. Because one of the things that Phoebe points out in her introduction is, I think toward the end, she talks about kind of somewhat laboring, or at least thinking through how she was going to organize things. And at first she thought she would do it more thematically, kind of like maybe McLeod did several years ago. But then she decided to just do it alphabetically. And it just seemed easier to her because she felt a little, I don't know, self-conscious or weighed down in terms of the whole theme thing. But this is something that's also up to the series editor?
Yeah, definitely.
Or I'm sorry, the guest editor.
Yeah. Every volume's been a little different in that regard. As you mentioned, Scott McLeod came into it with a very strong idea that he wanted to organize the book thematically. And so he did that. And Jonathan Lethem admired the way Scott's organization had kind of broken up the reading experience into something almost like chapters. Mm-hmm. So he followed suit. And then the following year when I was working with Roz Chest, I basically said, well, the past couple guest editors have done this. You don't have to do that. We could do something else, whatever you think. And she wasn't motivated to organize things into thematic categories. She just wanted the pieces to follow one another in a way that she thought flowed well and that, provided a kind of sense of contrast from one piece to the other, and created a fluid reading experience. And similarly, Ben Ketchor followed suit in that regard. And as Phoebe described, I think very well in her introduction, she did think about that quite a bit. And she was thinking about doing thematic sections as certain thematic ties emerged between and among some of the pieces that she was leaning towards including. But as she said in the introduction, as she began to think about what that would look like and how those topics would break out, she realized that it was influencing her choices about individual pieces, that she felt like, oh, wait, I have a lot of this kind of thing and not a lot of that kind of thing. So maybe I need to swap something else in so that the book is more balanced and so on. And, I think she felt that, she really wanted to be evaluating the pieces on an individual basis, and not then, which is difficult enough, and not add this extra layer of criteria, which had which would have had something to do with whether or not it was helping to round out a section in the book or not. I think she really, really wanted her choices to be about each piece individually. So in the end, she went with alphabetical order, and that worked out really well. Actually, I mean, surprisingly well. I was kind of amazed at how well the pieces flowed from one to another. I mean, it's essentially, alphabetizing is basically a way of randomizing, and as a sequence, it actually worked out really well with, I thought, nice contrast from one piece to the other.
Yeah, I have to say that had I not read her introduction, but just started this year's volume reading the various contributions from beginning to end, I may not even have paid attention to the alphabetical nature of the arrangements. They just seemed, I don't want to say that they seemed to flow almost organically from the one to the other, but the way that they were arranged made sense to me. So it wouldn't have surprised me not to have known about the alphabetical arrangement, but just to have read it and think that everything hung really well together.
I agree. Yeah. I mean, it's amazing how well it worked out.
Mm-hmm.
Another thing that stood out to me in Phoebe's, I'm gonna call her Phoebe Gloeckner's introduction is also the part where she talks about making a comic about hating comics, because she kind of got frustrated with the kind of time demands that go into making a comic and how quickly they're consumed by people, and just some little frustration. Do you get sick of comics? You read a lot of comics. You do a lot of things with comics, but that's just a question.
I don't get sick of comics. I get very tired from reading comics, but I don't get tired of comics. That's one thing I could say. I think the only demand, how should I put it? I think the only thing that I feel is a kind of stricture, perhaps, is that I feel that between and among all of the various projects that I'm working on, and in particular with Best American Comics, I do feel that my reading is very structured and determined to a certain extent. I'm very hyper-focused on new North American work from the last 12 months for big chunks of the year. And then for the book I'm working on, I'm reading a lot of historical material. So there's a certain amount of work that comes out every year that I think I would probably pay more attention to as a reader if I had more time. And I'm talking about comics. For example, there have been quite a few new North American translations of international works that I'm interested in. There's a new book by Breccia that Fantagraphics just published, Mort Sender, that I'm eager to read. And I think it was IDW published a couple of volumes of Munoz and Sampaio, and, some other things like that, and that's all stuff that in theory I'd like to get around to reading too. I'd like to get around to reading, but I just haven't had the time or space to get to that kind of material. So, I know that when I finish working on Best American Comics one of these days, I'll probably feel a lot more free as a reader to just kind of pursue my interests. Although, on the other hand, I will miss having this kind of privileged access to a wide view of contemporary comics as well.
I'm glad that you brought this up, Sturge, because when I read Phoebe's introduction and saw the part where she had mentioned that sometimes she gets a little frustrated about how quickly the consumption time is for comics compared to other media, right? I mean, a great example of that is prose. It reminded me of something that's come up with me every now and again, and that is, how serious of an art form is comics if it can be consumed within, several minutes or relatively briefly compared to, let's say, a short story or definitely a novel. And I've even had students say that to me at times. My response has always been, okay, when you're in a museum, how long does it take you to take in a painting? And it could take an extremely long time. But again, relative to how long it takes to read a novel, very brief. So is painting any less an art form than novel writing? Or let's say theater. You know, you're in a theater for 2 to 3 hours to watch a play. That's not that long compared to how long it takes for you to read, let's say, Moby Dick, you know, or
Right.
Huckleberry Finn, let's say, you know, sticking with Americans. And which I tend to do, or I could say something like Anna Karenina. How about that? But that doesn't make theater any less of an art form, or even poetry for that matter. So within that context, you know, the time rate of consumption really means nothing, although I think we nonetheless tend to think in those terms. I remember the very first time I interviewed Gilbert Hernandez, one of the things that he said frustrated him, and this was not that long after his first big collection, Palomar, if you remember, that nice hardback edition that Fantagraphics did. He said that one of the things that stuck in his craw was someone coming up to him and say, I really loved Palomar. I sat down and read it in one day. And he said, and it took me he said, I labored over all of those things for, you know, so many days, hours, and weeks and months.
Years.
And then years. And then someone just sits down and consumes it within a 24-hour period. You know, that didn't sit well with him. But, you know, I think that the time of consumption really means nothing when it comes to any kind of issues of legitimacy.
Sure. And I think that was one of the things that Phoebe was talking about in her introduction. I think she was addressing, and I think that connected very specifically to what she did in Diary of a Teenage Girl, where she combined comics and prose and illustration so that she was able to explore the different potentialities or the affordances of all of those different media that she was kind of mixing together, so that when it was necessary for the work for perhaps the reader to slow down and explore the interior life of the character, that's what the prose does. And when it was necessary for the work to maybe externally show the events of the narrative at a different kind of pace, and also in a way that really revealed the visual experiential side of it, that's what the comics were able to do. And Part of the reason why I was very happy to have Phoebe Gloeckner as the guest editor is precisely because her view of comics is somewhat unconventional, or perhaps we could say, she's someone who's, has pushed it at the boundary of the form in her work. And she's someone who comes from the world of comics, who loves comics deeply, but doesn't feel tied down to the culture of comics nor the conventions of making comics. So I think that she brought a really great perspective to the material that she considered for this year's volume.
Now, that leads me to another question. We've talked about, to some degree, both in this interview and previous ones we've had with you on the podcast, the process of choosing the comics to be included in each year's volume. What about the process of you deciding on a guest editor? I mean, what are some of the things that you think about, that you keep in mind? I mean, how does this all come about?
Well, generally, it's a process that's somewhat collaborative in that we have a huge amount of latitude in terms of what we put into the book. We don't have to get any approval for any of that. Whatever the guest editor wants to put in, if we can get permission to include it, it goes into the book. There are a few areas where Houghton Mifflin Harcourt has some input, and one of them is the choice of the guest editor. So essentially what happens is I just propose several possible guest editors, and they express their preferences. I think just based on a notion of who they think might be, might bring some attention to the volume for one reason or another. And then it's a matter of inviting people to do the book and seeing who's available, because it's a commitment. It's a commitment of several months of attention, and there are a lot of people who I'd love to work with, but who just haven't been able to do it in a given year when I ask them if they might be available. So it's but from my point of view, what I'm really happy about is that I've worked with a group of guest editors who bring quite different perspectives to the volume from year to year. The first two guest editors who I worked with, Scott McCloud and Jonathan Lethem, had actually already been selected or contracted when I came into the position. I think the outgoing series editors, Matt Madden and Jessica Abel, had already secured their participation before they ultimately exited their role as series editors. And those were both great people to work with, because Scott is like the ultimate comics insider, and Jonathan Lethem is someone who knows a lot about comics and really loves comics, but comes at it from a very different perspective. He's principally a novelist, so he was kind of, sort of, if you might say, standing off to the side of the field and perspecting it and viewing it from a very different perspective, from a different vantage point. And I think that pattern has kind of followed since then. Roz Chast has a very different perspective from Jonathan Lethem, and she herself is a cartoonist, which in some ways, and she had produced a graphic novel or a graphic memoir, Can't We Please Talk About Something More Pleasant? So she's definitely cartoonist, she's in the field, but at the same time, she exists in this maybe more specialized area of the New Yorker cartoonist, which, again, gave her a very different point of view on the kinds of contemporary comics that I was sending her to look at. And then, we followed Roz with Ben Ketchor, who in some ways is very much in the middle of the comics scene. He teaches at Parsons and runs a comics symposium there, and sees a lot of contemporary work and a lot of young contemporary artists pass through that symposium and talk about their work. But at the same time, Ben is kind of uncategorizable in a lot of ways too. He has a very different, his work is not like anyone else's really, and he has a very different idea about comics than most people. He sort of sees comics in this genealogy that includes illustrated song sheets and balladeers who show images and things like that. I mean, he sees a connection between comics and theater, which isn't a common way of looking at the genealogy of comics. And then Phoebe Gloeckner is also someone who takes, I think, in a totally different way, a kind of unconventional approach to making visual narrative work. So I think as a result, every volume has felt pretty different from the one before it, which I hope highlights the strength of the project of having these guest editors come in every year to bring a different subjective point of view to contemporary comics. So I think part of what I'm looking for moving ahead is to sort of keep that pattern going, so that we follow up one guest editor with another who's going to have a very different take on the field. And I think that's important.
Bill, there's a question that's kind of been rattling around in my head, and it's this might be a crazy question, so I'm going to foreground it a little bit. You can't control how a book is taken up once it's out there in the world, and whatever your intentions are. But I'm thinking a lot about, before you were talking about one of the places you go are comic shops. And when you go to comic shops, the people that run them run the gamut. I've been in shops where somebody acts like, I need to have everything available because I never know what people want. They also have this kind of business sense, like I need to have things that I know will go off the shelves that people will definitely be interested in. Some of them are more like gatekeepers, or they feel like they're the tastemakers for their customers. Like I don't buy things I don't like. And some people think of like they're curators, even like I need to keep a history of the medium or a history of a certain, type of comic or something like that. And if you had to pick a metaphor to describe your role as editor, what you hope happens. I mean, what would you say you hope happens with this book as an editor? Like, what do you do to try to make that happen? I don't know if that made any sense. That's kind of a crazy question.
I think I understand what you're asking. It's an interesting question in part because I sort of have two relationships to the book, in the sense that I have a very direct role in presenting work to the guest editor, and a kind of indirect role in presenting the guest editor's perspective to readers, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
And they're, I think when I'm sending stuff to the guest editor, to a certain extent, I want to show them the range of what I'm seeing. And I also definitely want to be sending them the things that, as far as I understand it, they might be interested in seeing. But I do also have, I think, maybe a little bit more like the curatorial comic book store manager or owner, a little bit of a feeling sometimes of being like a comic sommelier or something, like or whatever, serving up a tasty cheese dish of new and unexpected sensations that they might not have seen before. So, I have a more direct relationship there. But beyond that, as far as the book goes, I'm confident that whatever the final choices are in the book, they're all strong and valid, and that they represent well what's interesting in the field of contemporary comics. So I think on a real basic level, I hope that readers will take the book as a kind of core sample of what's happening in contemporary comics. I hope that they'll attend to the point of view of the guest editor and engage it, because I do think that remains from year to year an extremely interesting part of the book, but it's one that's maybe a little hard to talk about because it's something that is being experienced indirectly through this collage-like assembly of an anthology. And I hope that, however the readers receive the book, I hope that they will, at the very least, if nothing else, find a few things in there that encourage or inspire them to seek out more work by the artist.
Gotcha. This is a silly practical question to follow up on this, my fancy metaphor question. Do you have an amazing comic collection after all of it? Like, do you have a warehouse? Where do you get to keep these books?
Well, the things that actually get selected to go into the book get forwarded to Houghton Mifflin Harcourt, and they use them in the production process for, format and color matching and things like that. I do end up with quite a few other books, as you can guess. I have too many books, as probably I would guess all of us do.
Yeah.
It's a problem. I definitely can't keep everything that I end up with, but I still end up with far too much.
Yeah, that's my question too. I'm experimenting with ways I can use them to insulate my house or something, so I can store them and they're practical. But no,
I mean, I'm literally looking at like a bookshelf that has a pile of books on the floor sitting in front of it. That's not the only.
Oh, you have some on bookshelves. The floor is where mine are. And in fact, because of family situations with my dad over the past couple of years, I'm currently living in Charlotte, and my wife and kids are living back in the Dallas, Texas area. So my wife was visiting, about a month and a half ago, and in my quote unquote studio, which like used to be a living room, but it's where I'm recording from right now because it's pretty good sound. I have tons of books that are just sitting on the floor, many of which are review copies, because being in the media, as both of you are well aware, you get them whether you want them or not. And so my wife saw this and said, "Are you going to do something with those? Do you need them?" Yeah. That's one of the biggest challenges. No, Bill, what I was going to ask is, you've been doing this for about 6 years, as you've mentioned. You've been a part of HMH's Best American Comics project. Do you have a particular vision or an idea of something you'd like to do that may be a tad different from what you have been doing with the series in years to come?
You mean within the context of working on Best American Comics?
Yes.
I don't know. I think right now the best thing I can do is just try and ensure that we have a good diversity of guest editors, because there's a lot about the book that's more or less fixed in terms of the structure of how it functions and the format of the book physically. I don't see any of that changing into the future. So I think probably the best thing I can do is to just try and keep more fresh voices coming in to the guest editor role. And I think they will maybe at this point do more to change what the book is even than I can, in a sense. And again, not by actually changing what the book is, but rather by taking a new, continuing to take new and fresh approaches to contemporary comics every year. And because, I think these roles otherwise are pretty structured. I think the series editor role is pretty structured. The book itself is pretty structured. Mm-hmm. And it's not just for this series, it's for all of the Best American series. So there's a lot of parameters around this role, but within that, we have a lot of flexibility to bring in different people in the guest editor role, and we have total freedom to include whatever work the guest editor sees fit. So I think those are the ways that the book is going to continue to evolve from year to year.
That makes a lot of sense. But what about on the level of guest editor? And again, I don't want you to give anything away that you shouldn't give away, but do you have a particular idea of doing something maybe a little different with guest editors, let's say? Because you make the point that it's the guest editor who gives the unique flavor every year to a particular volume of Best American Comics. Most of the editors or guest editors that have been chosen since, the very first one, Harvey Pekar, have been comics creators to a greater or lesser degree, right? You mentioned Lethem. His background is in prose fiction. However, he's done work in comics. And then there's Francois Mouly, who has worked in comics, but maybe more as an editor than a creator. So I'm wondering, might you be thinking in terms of doing something different with the guest editors, or are they going to be comics creators for the most part?
That's an interesting question. There are a lot of people who are on my mental wish list of guest editors, and they do span a range of roles, although for sure the overwhelming majority are themselves cartoonists. I think if you're going to bring in someone, because in theory, these people who come into the guest editor role, not just on this series, but on all the Best American series, are people who anyone would say, yes, of course, that person is credibly experienced in such a way as to decide in a manner that I would want to pay attention to what maybe the best work of the year might be, whether it's the best short stories or the best essays or whatever. So it has to be someone who has a kind of credibility in the field. That's not to say that there aren't people who aren't cartoonists who don't have that credibility, and Francois Mouly and Jonathan Lethem are examples of that. And there are others out there, and there's certainly people who I'm interested in, but I think the overwhelming majority of the people you'd think of are cartoonists themselves. And again, that's consistent with what happens with Best American Short Stories and these other titles. Most of the people who edit Best American Short Stories are short story writers or prose writers or novelists. They're in that zone. So probably the majority of people who will fill that role will continue to be cartoonists. However, there are definitely some people in some other kind of adjacent or, who are involved in some other way, who I'd be very happy to work with if the opportunity arises. I think one of the other things I would like to see moving forward with the guest editors is to really acknowledge the fact that at this point, the series has been around for, about 12 years since the 2006 volume. I guess technically that's 11 years. And no, is that right? My math is not doing well today. But since 2006, the series has been coming out, and there are quite a few artists who have come along since the series started, who have built significant bodies of work, who I think we should consider for the role. And I think probably everyone who we've worked with up to this point is someone who was more or less already established when the series started in 2006. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of interesting to consider, too, that by this point, the series has been around long enough. There are people who maybe at this point have published people who have started since then, who maybe at this point have published as many books as some of the people who were guest editing the earliest volumes had at that point. Does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
So I think that's something that we need to do moving forward is not just be drawing from the pool of potential guest editors who were already, to some extent, let's say, well-known or established, by the time the series was launched in 2006.
When will we hear about, or when can you announce the guest editor for the 2019 volume?
I believe Houghton Mifflin Harcourt usually makes a kind of overall announcement of the guest editors for all the Best American titles early in the year. So sometime in early 2019. I don't remember exactly when that announcement came out this past year. I want to say it was like February, maybe late January, February, something like that. And at that point, the contents for all those books will be locked into, so there will be no point lobbying to the guest editor and harassing them or sending them your comic or something like that. Yeah.
I gotcha.
Well, Bill, I want to thank you for coming back on the Comics Alternative and talking with us about the current year's volume of Best American Comics. The 2018 volume came out in the fall of this year, and it's been out for a while. We will discuss it later this week on our regular review show, but we wanted to be sure to also have you on for another interview to get your take on it as series editor.
Well, thanks so much for having me on the show again.
Yeah, Bill, I really enjoyed the book, so keep it up and listen, keep up the good work.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Look forward to next year.
Thanks. I look forward to hearing your review of the book.
Cool. And I'll say Yasu and Harasu.
All right. Yes.
Yes, that's right. I had to throw in some Greek here.
Why not?
Wow, that was great talking to Bill Kartalopoulos about the 2018 volume of the Best American Comics from Houghton Mifflin Harcourt.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I always enjoy having Bill on the show to talk about the current year's volume, and I always love talking about the current year's volume, which we will do in a couple of days. So our listeners can check back for that.
Yeah, and I appreciate getting to know Greek people who make comics, so...
Yeah.
Opa! I can do an opa.
There you go. And maybe take a swig of ouzo as you do so.
Hey, it's a little early in the day.
Yeah.
It may help my cold.
Well, if you want to find great comics like the type that Bill and his guest editors collect every year for the Best American Comics volumes, you couldn't do better than checking out the website of our sponsor, which is Discount Comic Book Service. Remember, go to dcbservice.com. They have great discounts every single month. They'll take care of you. That's dcbservice.com.
That's right. Tell them the two guys with PhDs sent you.
Please do. And after you do get your titles there, get in touch with us and let us know what you thought about our interview with Bill Kartalopoulos. If you go to our website, comicsalternative.com, you'll find that you could leave us a voice message online via SpeakPipe. Or you can contact us the old-fashioned way by picking up the phone and dialing 4153-COMICS. That's 415-326-6427.
Or you can email us at twoguys@comicsalternative.com. Or if you're inclined to just email me, I'm Sturge at comicsalternative.com.
And I'm Derek at comicsalternative.com. You can also find us all over social media. We have accounts on Twitter, Facebook, Tumblr, Instagram, Google+, Goodreads, Pinterest, YouTube, Slack, and Discord. You can subscribe to the podcast through Apple Podcasts. You can stream us on Stitcher. You can also find us on Spotify, on Google Podcasts, on TuneIn, and on iHeartRadio, among other outlets. But you can find every single one of our episodes, as well as the reviews and comics-related commentary that we post on our blog, simply by going to our website, comicsalternative.com.
We're everywhere, but that is the one-stop shopping area.
It really is. And we also encourage you to subscribe to the show, not just listen to it, but individual episodes, but subscribe, because not only would that help us, but it would also keep you up to date with what we're doing, because we're doing a lot of stuff.
That's right. Help us, help you.
That's yeah. That should be our, I guess, secondary tagline, right? Our tagline is two guys with PhDs talking about comics. So maybe help us help you.
There you go. I like that.
Yeah. And we will be back very soon with our take on the various entries in this year's Best American Comics. And remember that next week will be our final show of 2018, where Sturge and I will talk about what we consider our favorites of the past year.
That's right. It's our Boxing Day special.
That's right. And until then, I'm Derek.
I'm Sturge.
Take care.
Peace.